Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
Welcome to this week's episode of Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. This week, we look back to look forward as we see how leadership from Utah's business community has helped change America's immigration debate.
The Salt Lake Chamber drove an initiative that we call the Utah Compact, and it was a set of principles that talked about what we believed, not just as a business community, but as a community at large about immigration. And it talked about not just Utah, but the whole country. It's always an interesting conversation in our country. What is your ancestry? Where did your people come from? And in Utah, what we wanted to do was to say, look, let's not only recognize that, but let's honor that by having some principles that will guide how we think immigration ought to be dealt with as a policy issue.
Which is all the more urgent these days since Utah business leaders are clamoring for workers in all sectors.
There is not an industry that is not struggling to find people. 2 years ago, we would say our biggest challenge is a qualified workforce. Today, we say our biggest challenge is workforce, period.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani. I want to start this week's conversation with an admission. One of my favorite movies of all time is Back to the Future. Maybe it's the hoverboard, maybe it's the random Chuck Berry appearance, maybe it's just the DeLorean.
Doc! Marty! You made it!
Yeah.
Welcome to my latest experiment. This is a big one, the one I've been waiting for all my life.
Well, it's a DeLorean, right?
Bear with me, Marty. All your questions will be answered. Roll tape.
So let's take the immigration reform Back to the Future DeLorean all the way to 2010. That's the year that Spain wins the World Cup, Apple releases its first iPad, and Sandra Bullock wins Best Actress for The Blind Side. But in Arizona in 2010, Governor Jan Brewer signed SB 1070 into law. This was the legislation that, in essence, deputized local law enforcement to take on immigration responsibilities. Months after SB 1070's passage, proponents were looking at Utah as the next state to pass such legislation. But Utah's faith, law enforcement, and business community was having none of it. For several months, these conservative leaders worked behind the scenes to develop a new approach to Utah's immigration debate, an approach that has come to be known as the Utah Compact. On November 10, 2010, the Utah Compact was signed by a range of civic leadership in Salt Lake. Tom Love, chair of the United Way of Salt Lake, described the Compact's 5 principles.
The Utah Compact has broad support from community leaders, business associations, law enforcement officers, and members of Utah's religious community. It's a simple document that expresses community values as they relate to specific policy issues that have become central to the immigration discussion.
In April of 2016, when I was doing research for my book, There Goes the Neighborhood, I spent a good chunk of time in Utah speaking with many of the leaders behind the Utah Compact. In doing that research, I developed a much greater appreciation for the leadership of the Mormon Church. In fact, one afternoon on that trip, I attended the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints General Conference, the biannual convening of the church's membership. Over 21,000 gather in Salt Lake and millions watch from around the world. That afternoon, I was one of the 21,000 in that massive auditorium. That was when Elder Patrick Kieran delivered a powerful sermon that included this.
Being a refugee may be a defining moment in the lives of those who are refugees, but being a refugee does not define them. Like countless thousands before them, this will be a period, we hope a short period in their lives. Some of them will go on to be Nobel laureates, public servants, physicians, scientists, musicians, artists, religious leaders, and contributors in other fields. Indeed, many of them were these things before they lost everything. This moment does not define them, but our response will help define us.
And just a week or so earlier, Linda K. Burton, Relief Society General President, spoke to an audience of women and girls, and she recalled the story of Brigham Young's call to action in 1865 to rescue the handcart pioneers struggling to get to Salt Lake. It was a moment in their collective history that Mrs. Burton linked to the refugee crisis of 2015.
My beloved sisters, this account might be likened to our day and those who are suffering throughout the world.
Another extraordinary occasion touches our hearts. There are more than 60 million refugees, including forcibly displaced people worldwide. Half of those are children. These individuals have undergone tremendous difficulties and are starting over in new countries and cultures. While there are sometimes organizations that help them with a place to live and basic necessities, what they need is a friend, an ally who can help them adjust to their new home, a person who can help them learn the language, understand the systems, and feel connected.
The point here is that Utah, one of the nation's most conservative states, has a deep cultural connection to immigrants and refugees through their own journey as immigrants and refugees. As evidenced by the Utah Compact, immigration isn't about politics and policy for Utahns. Rather, immigration is about culture and values for the Beehive State and the desire to treat immigrants and refugees with compassion. This is an approach that continues to this day, whether it's at the Salt Lake Chamber, the Salt Lake Mayor, or the governor's offices of Utah. It's leadership that, quite frankly, is sorely needed across the country.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Noorani. My guest this week is Derek Miller, President and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber. Based on the economic importance and vitality of the Salt Lake region, the Chamber has become one of the most important business organizations across the Mountain West, and they have deep ties to policymakers across the nation. Derek was raised in Provo, just south of Salt Lake City, and later graduated from BYU, or Brigham Young University. His career has spanned the public and the private sector, and from urban to rural parts of the Beehive State. Before we get to my conversation with Derek, I have to highly recommend Utah as a place to visit. The people are fantastic, the food is spectacular, and from skiing to hiking, there's just always something fun to do. Derek, thank you very, very much for joining today. Really, really appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Good to be with you, and it's always nice to talk with smart people on important topics, so thank you.
Well, this is an important topic, but I'm not sure you're talking with anybody very smart, so you may be on the wrong podcast, we'll see. So before we kind of jump into the issue of immigration, how did you end up where you are today?
It's a good question. How did I end up here? I ask myself that a lot, actually. It's certainly a plum position here in the Salt Lake community, and the Salt Lake Chamber is the longest and largest business association in the state and comes with a lot of responsibility. My background, I mentioned to you earlier that I'm an attorney by training. I actually did a joint degree when I was in college, but never really practiced law. I've always been interested in business, but I've been particularly interested in business and the intersection with public policy. And so I've been lucky to have positions that have put me at that intersection. I worked for a time on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., started my career in DC as a management consultant, and a few years ago had the opportunity to move back to Utah, working for our then governor, John Huntsman, in his economic development office. He left, as you may remember, to be the ambassador of China. Mm-hmm. And while he was serving as governor, and his lieutenant governor, our current governor, Governor Herbert, when he ascended to the office and ran for special election, he asked me to serve as his chief of staff, which I did for several years, and then went to the World Trade Center Utah, which is part of the World Trade Center Global Network. Did that for 4 years, and about a year ago, started at the Chamber.
You're from Utah? Where'd you grow up?
I did grow up in Utah. I grew up in Provo, which is about 30 miles south of Salt Lake City, where Brigham Young University is located, and both of my parents are professors at BYU.
I got to say, I think Utah is one of the most underappreciated states in the country. It's just gorgeous.
We are certainly blessed with wonderful geography. I'm not sure that the early settlers in 1847 would have said that. It was a pretty harsh environment that they were moving to. They actually did that intentionally because, as you know, Utah was settled by early Mormon pioneers, and they were being driven out of their homes in the east and they wanted to go somewhere that they said no one else would want. We'll go somewhere where nobody will try to take our homes away from us. And they got to a high mountain desert that didn't have much by way of rainfall. It certainly was not green from what they were used to in the eastern U.S., but they, with a lot of hard work and ingenuity, said they were going to make the desert blossom as a rose, taking a phrase from the Old Testament. And they did it, and we're the beneficiaries of that.
I've been working on immigration policy, for about 10, 12 years. And the state of Utah, and particularly Governor Herbert, his leadership on issues of immigration, to me has been really, really interesting. What was it like serving as his chief of staff when these issues came up?
Well, I'll answer the question broadly and then maybe narrow down to a specific instance to illustrate a point. And I will say that working with Governor Herbert was really probably going to be the high watermark for my career. He's just a man of integrity, and he's a seventh generation Utah, and he has a good sense of the people, and he really takes this kind of a familial approach and attitude towards his governorship of the state. I can't even tell you the number of times that as we were debating policy issues and talking about very difficult challenges, including immigration, he would often pause and just say, what's the right thing to do here? And, that sounds pretty simple. But sometimes, as you know, when you're dealing with tough issues, it's easy to get wrapped around an ideological axle. So to be able to bring it back down and say, what's the right thing to do for the people of Utah, for the communities in Utah, specifically to immigration, I remember still to this day very vividly, and you'll remember what was happening nationally as well. You had a lot of governors, because of real or perceived security threats, saying they didn't want to take any more refugees in their states. And it was really interesting. We were in a meeting because we started seeing this come across the wire. Governor so-and-so has said they won't accept the resettlement of any more refugees. And it turned from a wave really to a tsunami in an awful kind of a way that at the end of the day, you had every single sitting Republican governor. I think at the time there were 31 of them. So you had 31 governors in 31 states say, we're not going to take refugees anymore. And because Governor Herbert is a Republican governor, a tremendous amount of pressure started to be applied to him, saying, you need to say this for Utah as well. And not only did he not say that, but he actually issued a statement that I think reflects well on the attitude for the state of Utah. And it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. Our heritage and our history and the settlement of Utah was from religious refugees. And Governor Herbert in his statement actually referenced that. He said, and I'll paraphrase here, but I think I'm going to get it pretty close word for word. He says, the governor of a state that was settled by refugees, Utah, under my leadership, and as long as I'm governor, will always be a state that welcomes refugees.
I remember that. I remember that moment in the political environment. And I remember when Governor Herbert said, no, this is who we are as a state. Is really quite remarkable.
It was great to have a front row to that occurrence in our state.
So in your time in Utah, growing up or there professionally, and obviously as the leader of the Salt Lake Chamber, how has the state's economy changed, and how has that changed in the context of immigration?
Well, I think that, first of all, there's a perception of the state of Utah as being a pretty homogeneous state. And there was a time when that was the case. But certainly in our urban areas. And as you know, Utah is unique because it's almost all urban. Unlike most Western states, we do have a lot of rural area, but there are not many people who live in those rural areas in the state of Utah. In fact, 85% of our population lives along an 80-mile corridor, what we call the Wasatch Front, the front of the Wasatch Mountains. And so Salt Lake City sits at the center of that, and it extends 40 miles to the north and 40 miles to the south, and it's bounded by mountains to the east and lakes to the west. And so it's not a wide corridor either. So in a pretty narrow 80-mile area, you have a pretty dense metropolitan area. And within that metropolitan area, you've seen the demographics change. In fact, I live and, of course, work in Salt Lake City. The high school where all of my children attended is a majority minority high school. So we've seen that change a lot. In addition, we've seen our economy change a lot. When I graduated from college in 1998, I wondered to myself, what do people do in Utah? I mean, if you want to have a job, what do you do? And the answer for me was to leave Utah and to move to Washington, D.C. and start my career and start my family. The economy today, of course, fast forward 20 years, and we're the fastest growing economy in the country. We are the most diverse economy in the country. And speaking candidly, our greatest challenge right now is finding enough workers. It's another reason why immigration is so important to us, because we recognize that our economy will underperform and will not be as it should be in capacity unless we can get workers. And that, of course, includes immigrant workers, but it includes workers from all walks of life.
And so then how does this play out in the public debate within Utah? I mean, you've got amazing things that have happened in Utah, like what Governor Herbert did around refugee resettlement. What's the state of the political conversation in Utah these days when it comes to immigration?
Well, I think most people recognize that Utah is a pretty conservative state, a deep red state, but we're also pretty unique in our politics as well. Again, I attribute that, a lot of it, to our history and our heritage. It's a pretty unique combination because, like other Western states, part of our culture is rugged individualism and up by your bootstraps kind of mentality, and we revere that. But you have combined with that this idea that when these pioneers got here and found this very harsh environment with very little running water, they, I think, recognized that not only was it going to take hard work up by your bootstraps, but that it was going to take working together. And there is a sense of community building in Utah when you combine that with that rugged individualism. I think it makes for a pretty unique culture. How that impacts the politics, and specifically as it relates to immigration, and you referenced some of the negativity, at least in my opinion, coming out of the Arizona state legislature and passing some anti-immigration laws. The result from Utah was a significant pushback. In fact, the Salt Lake Chamber drove an initiative that we call the Utah Compact. And it was a set of principles that talked about what we believed, not just as a business community, but as a community at large, about immigration. And it talked about not just Utah, but the whole country. I mean, when you think about it, except for a very few small population, relatively speaking, of Native Americans, we all come from somewhere. You know, it's always an interesting conversation in our country. What is your ancestry? Where did your people come from? That's a pretty unique thing about the United States of America. And I think in Utah, what we wanted to do was to say, look, let's not only recognize that, but let's honor that by having some principles that will guide how we think immigration ought to be dealt with as a policy issue.
For us at the forum, from afar, we learned so much from the leadership of Utah as that compact was being drawn together. And I think you've touched on this a little bit over the course of this conversation, is how do you find this balance between speaking to the state's culture and heritage, but then also speaking to the state's bottom line? Because you find that sweet spot there, you can be very persuasive. If you miss that sweet spot, then it feels like, you know, we're just talking to one side or the other.
That's a really great point. And it's actually a point that I make a lot when I talk to groups as it relates to, you know, the recent U.S. presidential election and what we see happening on a national level. And I have usually made it in the point of my previous job at the World Trade Center as I've talked about exports. And, you know, you talk about some of the Rust Belt states, and there's a good reason why some of those people felt left behind. It's because they were left behind. This was not a manufactured or a fake feeling. The economies had changed, and many of these communities had not kept up with where the economy was headed. And so I think that's why you see a great deal of negativity, negative association with immigration. You know, if there's an idea that says, well, you know, I'm not doing too well, and who's to blame? Often immigrant communities or refugees are used as a scapegoat. I would be the first to recognize that Utah has not had to deal with that problem. Our economy has been very strong. Even through the Great Recession, we didn't come close to taking the same kind of dip that other states did. So it was not as severe in Utah. We came out of it faster than most other states. We came out of it stronger than most other states. And so to your point, there is a great benefit to be able to not have to feel like your attitude or your approach to immigration is being impacted by the fact that the economy is bad.
So then why does it remain so difficult, whether it's in Utah or at a national level, to say, okay, this is the practical solution that serves our state's interests or our national interests?
Well, I don't know the answer to that, but I will say,
Oh, man, come on.
I will venture an opinion in this way, and that is that I do believe that if we can, let me back up a half a step and say that I recognize that there is a lot of strong feeling around what some people would call amnesty, for example, or even the creation of a pathway to citizenship. And so as Congress has tried to grapple with this issue, one of the very difficult challenges they have is how do you reconcile the very far left and the far right to come with a middle of the road solution, which actually I think the middle of the road solution is pretty straightforward. And I think most Americans would agree with this. And that is we want an immigration system that can keep out the bad guys and let in the good guys. And I say that with full understanding and recognition that that's easier said than done. But if you were to articulate the start of an immigration policy, I think it would be that. Anybody who wants to come and contribute to society and be part of building their community and at the same time improving their own personal situation and their ability to support their family, then yeah, let's let those people come in. We also have to, at the same time, be able to keep out the people who would come for nefarious purposes. But that, I believe, starts with border security. Now, that can be controversial to say because, you've got the whole Trump's wall deal. I mean, that's a political sort of a loaded lightning rod phrase. But as just a general concept of securing the border so that as a country and as a people, we can decide who comes in and who doesn't, I honestly think that has to be the starting point. And the reason I think it has to be the starting point is because I believe if we could do that, if we could actually have that kind of control, then I think the mood of the country would change pretty quickly. I think you'd see a lot more people who today are opposed to amnesty, opposed to a pathway to citizenship, even opposed to helping the dreamers, that those people, I think, would come around because they would see, okay, well, we finally have our hands on the problem and we're not just kicking it down the road.
Right. There's a sense of control over who's coming in and who's not coming in.
If you don't have that, then I think most people would say, well, all we're doing is solving the problem temporarily, and then we're going to face the same problem again 10 years from now.
And would you agree that a big part of the solution is actually having a functional legal immigration system?
Yeah. So thank you for mentioning that. And this is what people would say, right? You have a tall wall and a broad gate. So, you have to be able to have the corollary to border security is how do you let people in? How do you determine whether they're coming for good and noble purposes and how they would contribute to society? But my gosh, what we have now is not just broken, it's actually upside down. Because not only are we not able to keep people out who come for ill intent, but we also don't let the ones who would contribute stay. So, I mean, how crazy is that we've got a legal system right now that we're, educating some of the world's best and brightest. And then when they're done with their education, we say, okay, now go home. I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all to me.
So when you look at the economy in the Salt Lake region, which industries are kind of most worried about the lack of a functioning immigration system?
Well, the truth is all of them. I mean, there is not an industry that is not struggling to find people. 2 years ago, we would say our biggest challenge is a qualified workforce. Today, we say our biggest challenge is workforce, period. But it's everything. So these aren't just retail jobs or construction jobs or tourism jobs. I mean, these are jobs all the way up to the high-tech manufacturing, of course, our growing IT industry. There's not an industry out there that I don't meet with that doesn't say we need to be able to find more people.
Mm-hmm. Another thing about Utah to me that's interesting is that so many residents of Utah have had an international experience, right? So in that way, the state has a global sense to it that is, I think, really, really important. How do we help the American public see why that family is fleeing Honduras and why they see America as the land of hope? And is there an economic self-interest for us as a country to help that, or is there only a humanitarian self-interest?
Well, we like to say here, and I say this often, that yes, it is an economic imperative, but it's also a moral imperative. And how nice that you can do both things, that it's not just about one or the other. So you referenced the work that I did prior to this job at the Salt Lake Chamber, and I saw this firsthand, and I saw it not just along the Wasatch Front in our urban core, but I also saw it in the rural communities. And it was actually, for me, the most gratifying, and it related directly to the international experience that many Utahns have that you referenced. I would go meet with these companies and these community leaders in these small towns of a few hundred people. And there would be somebody with, a business. I remember one in particular, somebody who had a business selling Western wear, and they were online and they were selling to foreign countries. And I just thought, what a great example. And I said, why is it that you are doing this as opposed to, just kind of right here at home? And the person said, well, because I speak Spanish. And I'm able to, talk to people who want to buy this stuff in Spanish, and I can do the website in Spanish. And it was because of an international experience the individual had as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ on their Mormon mission. They had learned to speak Spanish, and it not only gave them a language skill, but as you indicated, it gave this person and many, many other people an appreciation for another culture, a love for another culture. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of knowledge and experience takes away the ignorance, and it takes away the fear, and it takes away perceived barriers in dealing with people. And it's been a great benefit to our state. It'd be hard to quantify it. I mean, we can talk about the fact that, there are over 100 languages spoken in daily commerce in Utah, but even that doesn't really quantify the heart of the matter, which is when you live somewhere among people for 2 years, it changes your outlook.
And that story you just shared, I would bet good money it would be a complete surprise to just about everybody, right? Because we have a stereotype of somebody who lives in rural America that they are incredibly insular. And in this case, it's the polar opposite.
I've got a son who's serving a mission right now, and he's serving in London. I mean, probably one of the most cosmopolitan, diverse cities in the world. And one of his missionary companions was from a tiny little town in Utah of 100 people, and he'd never been outside of his own town. And I think all the time about this young man who grew up on a farm and is now living in London. I mean, this experience he's having is going to change his life. And that doesn't mean that he won't necessarily go back to the farm. He might. But even if he does go back to the farm, and there are thousands of them from Utah that do, it will have still changed his life.
So what lies ahead for the chamber in the context of immigration policy, whether it's at the local, the state, or the federal level?
Interestingly enough, and good timing with our chat here, we actually just in the last few days have decided with the other original partners of the Utah Compact that we're going to do a re-signing. We are going to do an event here in the next couple weeks where we're bringing the original partners together. And there's a couple purposes for it. The first, of course, is the fact that we think it's a timely issue that needs some new highlighting. We're not changing the principles. They're good, solid principles, and so they don't need changing, but they need to be reinforced and they need to be highlighted again. The second purpose for it is that because it was done almost 10 years ago, there are a lot of those original signers from the business community that are no longer in their positions. They've retired or moved or gone on to other things. And so we've just had a real desire by the new generation, the new wave of business leaders in Utah, to add their voice to this chorus of calling for common sense and humane immigration.
Do you think that the people who are going to be joining you all in a couple of weeks to re-sign the compact, do you think people understand the impact the Utah Compact had on the country's immigration debate?
I don't think they do. I don't think any of us do. I wouldn't even say that I do. Utah is an interesting place because we kind of just do our thing. And I mean, we do think about the world around us as we've been talking about, but I don't think that we have an appreciation. I certainly did not until I started traveling internationally for my work, when people, would say, oh, Utah, this is happening there, or that's happening there. Most people, their first introduction to the state is through our national parks. We have 5 beautiful national parks, and it brings a whole host of international visitors. But then when they come back and learn more about the state, and they start to learn more about what's happening economically and things like the Utah Compact, and I think that by and large may be lost on us.
I could regale you with 2 hours of stories of examples of why the compact in 2010 was just a a really, really, really important moment in the nation's immigration debate. And as I look back, I kind of shudder to think where we would be if the compact had not been issued at that point in time.
Well, luckily, we don't have to live in that world and don't have to think too much about it. But you have to be ever vigilant. And that's one of the reasons why we think it's time to reinforce and highlight again the compact.
So my last question for you, and I ask everybody who's a guest this particular question, and it's just a request to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
See, this was the question I wish you would have said in advance, so I could have said something prescient and intelligent.
That's why I never send it in advance.
I think it goes to what I said about we're a nation of immigrants. And when you look around, you see what we've created. And it's a pretty recent phenomenon. As a country, we really only became a superpower and took a position as the top economy, and as others have called it, the shining light on the hill, coming out of World War I and then solidifying that position in World War II. And so, in a historical sense, that's not long ago. But I would say only in America can you have such a diversity of people and a diversity of thought, and sometimes even maddeningly so, but we still seem to come to the right place. And I have faith, I have confidence that we will continue to do that into the future.
Derek, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you taking the time.
It's been great to be with you, and thanks for your interest and your support for our state and our community.
Derek Miller is the president and CEO of the Salt Lake Chamber in Utah. For more information about Derek, please visit our website, immigrationforum.org, and while you're there, take a minute to subscribe to Only in America. Only in America is produced by Regina Medina and Emily Chow. Our sound editor this week is Joanna Taylor. Kathleen Farrell is executive producer, and I'm Ali Noorani. Thank you so much for listening. I will talk to you next week.